Welcome to the Roundtable, a podcast of Lakeside Church. We hope today's discussion leaves you encouraged. For more information on how to connect, please visit our website, lakesidechurch.ca. Well, hello and welcome to the Roundtable. My name is Daniel Bell. I am the site pastor at Lakeside Downtown. And today I have with me Jaya James, the executive director of Hope House. We have the privilege of sharing a building where we do our work out of. We rent the space from Hope House, and it is just a great opportunity to be together. Jaya has been working at Hope House for almost 4 years, and she's a Guelphite herself. She's been in and around Guelph for quite a long time. And our relationship first began a few years ago, just before then, when my wife was commissioned to write an article about Jaya, and I was the photographer to take her photo. And so we've had a friendship and connection since then, and worked together in various capacities. But today we're going to be doing things a little bit different on the Roundtable. We're not going to be answering questions that you sent in about the sermon this past week, but rather me and Jaya, as friends, as co-workers, and as just people in Guelph, are going to have a conversation about race, about the relationships of race, about Jaya's experience in this city, in her own life. And we're going to, hopefully enter into some discussions, some of them that will be easy, some of them that may be difficult. And we are not proclaiming to have all the answers on this topic. Rather, this is a conversation between two friends that we're inviting you into and sharing with you. And so, Jaya, thank you so much for your willingness and just your generosity in taking the time out of your busy life to share with us. And so welcome to the Roundtable.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. It's good to be here.
No, it's our pleasure. So Jaya, I wanted just to start off, I'm assuming that everyone listening doesn't have an intimate, lifelong relationship with you, and neither do I, but I do know you. So would you be willing to share sort of your experience as a person of color growing up, and what that meant for you, and some different stories about that with us?
Yeah, so it's something I've been reflecting on more in the kind of recent weeks, as there's been a lot of stuff happening in the US. It's really forced me to look back on my life and look at what happened and how I kind of perceived it at the time and perceive it now. So my dad is African American. He's Black, raised in Waycross, Georgia, so the southern states, during segregation. My mother is Irish Canadian, raised in London, Ontario. They met and married and made the choice to live in Canada. And that was they distinctly made that choice because of the sense that it would be safer for them to raise a biracial family in Canada than it would be for them in the US. And so I grew up in this family that always kind of was walking these two lines. We had really close relationships with my mom's family in London, Ontario. Very much, your Irish Canadian kind of background, lots of fun and things that we did, but very much within that culture. And then spending time, summers often visiting my dad's family in Waycross, Georgia. So very much a Southern Black experience. So that was kind of the pieces that I had growing up.
Okay. And so that's two different worlds. I'm like Georgia and London, Ontario. What a difference. So in that experience, did you perceive any differences in the way people treated your parents at all?
Okay. So as I was thinking about this, my mom was always the one who would talk to us about race and talk to us about the things that happened. And so my mom very much acted as kind of the ally and communicated those things. My father, he had, and I will go into some stories from his life, he had a lot of very challenging experiences in his life, clearly racist experiences, but he didn't talk about them to us as kids directly. It was very much work very hard. He'd work very hard. He'd continue to plug ahead towards his goal. You were not going to knock him off of the path that he was going. He'd do anything in his power to keep going that way, and very much about protecting us as a family and making sure we were safe. So my mom would tell us the stories of what it would mean for them as a couple and what it would mean for my dad growing up. And so examples were things like when my mom would go down to visit my dad's family, she was always told just to keep her mouth shut when she was out visiting in the neighborhoods, because as long as she kept her mouth shut, people would actually think she was biracial. But as soon as she talked, people would know then she was white, and then there would be an issue. And so she would go and she'd be very quiet, which was easier for my mom. She's an introvert. She'd be very quiet when they were out in public. And then with the family, it was okay for her to talk. And that was a safe way to be. So she talked about things like that. They talked about why they chose to raise their family in Canada versus in the US. And as well, then they would talk about things from my father's past that kind of drove the decision. So my dad grew up in the South when it was still segregated. So he went to a school that if you were 1/8 Black, that's how you were defined as having being Black. If you had 1/8 of your heritage was Black, you had to attend this school. All the textbooks that came to your school were hand-me-downs from the white school, and they often were defaced and had racial slurs within them. If you were walking down the street, he was taught that if you was walking down the street, and if there was a white woman walking down the street, he crossed the street. There was no way you were allowed to walk beside them. If you go to the bank and you gave your money to the teller would have the right to pocket your money and you couldn't get it back. You always learned to sit facing the door so that you'd know who was coming in, and you always knew another exit out of the house. You always instructed your women never to open the doors to salesmen because it wasn't safe for them and there was nothing they could do if they were raped or attacked. And so these were the cumulative experiences that he went through. And he did also go through the civil rights era. So he did live through seeing many of those things broken down and removed. But from his family and living there, he knew that it just didn't disappear. And even today, if you go to the neighborhood where my father grew up, it's pretty much exclusively Black. And if you go to other parts of Waycross, they're pretty much exclusively white. It's still a very segregated community, even though there's more relationships across racial lines. That's starting to break down, and you're starting to see more relationships across racial lines, and you are seeing more interracial couples, but that's still not considered the norm or accepted behaviors.
Yeah, wow. What an experience. I know that if you do a Google search and you search segregation by cities for major cities, you can see maps of where each ethnic group lives, and it is still quite segregated in most cities. I've noticed that when you look at it. That's wild, Jaya, his experiences. Moving to Canada and to Guelph, I know we hear a lot of times people say, oh, so glad we're in Canada, we don't have these problems here. Yeah. And there is, the sentiment you just expressed on it felt safer to move here. Mm-hmm. Did your family growing up experience any similar things or anything, any type of racism or relation to racism living in Ontario?
So I think the thing I've really come to realize is the behaviors that my parents did that I didn't recognize were to protect us from that. We didn't go anywhere without a parent. So, and I know lots of parents spend time with their kids and hang out, but soccer games, my parents were present. During the practice, my parents were present. We had to always check in. They had to know exactly where we are. They had to know who we were with. And at the time I just thought it was because my parents were very protective and conservative. But I'm realizing more now that it was because they wanted to be a buffer and to help us if we ran into things. So the most common thing that we would get would be people would say, where are you from? And you tell them where you're from. Oh, I'm from Guelph, Ontario. No, where are you really from? Well, no, I'm really from here. No, but before that, and they always wanted to go further and further. It was never good enough just to be like a Canadian. And so that would be a big one. And another thing that we would regularly get is I was always having to choose. I'm technically, my mom's white, my dad's Black. I'm literally 50-50, like right. Equally split. But I was always expected to choose my Black identity. Right. That somehow became the whole calculation of who I was. It was everything that I was. It defined me completely. And it's kind of, it's this weird place where you have to kind of deny part of your heritage. My mother's side of the family, but it was kind of regularly thought that that was the appropriate thing, that I could not identify with them because we have a different skin color. Even though culturally, growing up in Canada, culturally, I'm much more aligned with my mother's family than I am with my father's, because I've grown up in this culture.
Right.
So those were kind of the things. I don't have memories for myself of a lot of racist comments and stuff happening. But I do know that for my brother, who's quite a bit darker than me, that he would have people call him a nigger. He had a girlfriend's family where the grandfather wouldn't even speak to him because he was so mad that she was dating a black man, and that was not okay. And so I know that it was harder for him. And I do know that there is very much, the darker you are, experience that it tends to be, it tends to be that you get more of the behaviors, negative behaviors tend to come out in your life. So that was kind of growing up. But we also, when I was growing up in Guelph, my mom used to talk about this all the time. We pretty much recognized every black family in the city when I was younger. Yeah. We didn't necessarily know each other all by name, but we knew who we were, and we could look around and see it. And since then, so I've been in the city over 40 years now, the city's demographics have changed exponentially. And now there's no way I could say that. There's just no way. It's so many more black families have moved in, so many more South Asian families moved in, so many more families from other parts of the world have moved in. And so when I was growing up, I don't think we were perceived as a threat because we were such a tiny, minuscule. It was easier for people to accept and to kind of feel safe. But as the demographics has changed within the city, and as a number of different kind of groups have gotten larger, and as a result start to celebrate their cultures and do more of their events, I've definitely felt a sense that there's more behaviors that are coming out. And so examples I'll give is that, so I have 3 sons. My sons all are biracial. Two of my sons look white, and my middle son looks like me. And this really emphasized for me the differences in experience that happen based on skin color, because here we are all from the same family, living in the same house, raised under the same scenario. So my kids go to a very small school, so everybody knows each other. Since my son was my middle son was in grade 1, it's normal for us 2 to 3 times a year to have a call from the school because someone's called them a nigger, and so we have to go and address that. Last year we had someone carve nigger in the tree in our front yard, and those things I don't remember happening when I grew up. No. And I started to talk with my other friends and saying, is it getting worse? And I kind of feel a little bit like people are feeling threatened and thinking that, and under that stress, are thinking certain things are okay. And so we know that when we go out with my son, my middle son, that we are much more likely to have to deal with racist behaviors than we will with my other 2. And yet, yet they're the same, when we're the same family. And so that's kind of the pieces that we've seen. And it's been hard because I don't want to talk necessarily about those things because I don't want to give them any more space in my life than they already have. I'd much prefer, because if we have lots of positive interactions, I'd much prefer to spend my energy and emotion and time on those positive interactions, because there's amazing people that are family and friends in our life. But I'm realizing that by not giving voice to those negative interactions, that it allows people to think that they don't happen, and it kind of gives a space for us as a community not to actually address the issues.
Yeah, right now in Guelph, it's happening. That's wild, Jaya. I thank you just for your boldness in sharing that, because that is vulnerable. that's hard to share, right? It's easy to keep the status quo and pretend like everything is all fine. One word that really stood out to me is that word threat. And it's funny, I can see a part of me, and many other people say, I don't feel threatened. But I think the threat a lot of us would feel is change. The idea of that things are changing around here. I don't always get my way, or not everything's going to look like how I want it to. And I think people are afraid of change, feel threatened by change, and react against it. And for some reason, don't see the humanity in others, which is disgusting. And yeah, I just can't believe that people would say things like that. But yet I can actually totally believe people would say things like that, just by the way in which people are willing to treat others. One of the words that is a hot word, I guess, in this whole discussion is the word privilege. And the idea that certain people are afforded certain privileges or born with certain privileges because of various reasons, their gender, their sexuality, their race, their socioeconomic background, their family dynamics, their physical abilities, and all sorts of things. And a lot of people get their back up to this idea of privilege, to say, no, I worked hard in my life. My parents, they didn't have much. I worked hard and I deserve everything I have. And I find, as Christians, privilege is a word I kind of, a lot of people don't like it, but I kind of do like it, because it feels a bit to me like it shows us that we aren't responsible for everything that's been handed to us. So I think of, my own life and the blessings that I have been allowed, the family that I grew up in, the community I grew up in, and that has afforded me countless opportunities in my life. But when it comes to race, it's quite obvious. We've been hearing more and more than ever now, and especially if I think of the stories you just shared, my kids have never had to endure anything like that, and I don't say that to belittle any of your experience, but in a sense to say, because they were born with a certain skin color, they have a privilege of not being harassed because of their race. Yeah, it's so unfortunate that your kids have, specifically your one son, has had to experience that. How have you witnessed the effects of privilege, or do you have any thoughts on that sort of word? I know we chatted a bit before about how there's so many dynamics to that, but do you have anything just to share about that idea?
Yeah, I get why people struggle with the word. It's a word, I think, that really challenges us. It challenges me as well. And I think that the key learnings that I'm learning right now, and I know I still have a ton more to learn, is that acknowledging a privilege doesn't somehow make you less of who you are as a person. And I think people kind of feel, in a sense, that somehow it takes away from the effort and the work that you've done. And that isn't the case. By acknowledging our privilege, what we're saying is that in addition to the hard work that I put in, I know that certain experiences or belonging to certain parts, belonging in the world in certain ways, has allowed me opportunities that are more difficult for other people to access. And so for myself, I look at it and I go, I grew up in a 2-parent family with very happily married parents who were, we were solidly middle class. I was offered the opportunities of dance lessons, music lessons, sports, which we all know have very positive outcomes for learning all sorts of teamwork skills and other things that makes it easier to achieve. I had parents who were able to help me with my schoolwork. I had challenges in school, and so did 2 of my other siblings. And I had parents who could help me with it, who could also afford to send my kids, 2 of my siblings, to a private school to do more one-on-one stuff. And because of that, every single one of my siblings, in addition to the hard work that they have put in, we are solidly middle income families.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that if you're a lower income family, you cannot get there. But it was easier for me to stay middle income coming from the family I came from than it is for both my parents were extremely poor growing up. And for them to break that barrier to cross over into middle income came at a much higher cost. Right. And the examples, so if I can give an example for my mother, who was white but extremely poor. There was no running water on houses on her street. Like her family did, but there was ones that didn't. And so she talks about distinctly in university, remembering that the professor who was teaching her class, saying that all the people on the east side London, they're just so stupid and dumb because, when they get a toothache infection, they go to the dentist and they have the dentist pull the tooth out rather than just get it filled. And, how could they be so silly to do this? Wow. And she remembers saying to herself, I could tell him the truth, but it most likely would embarrass him. And then I would probably get a lower grade. And he doesn't really even want to hear the truth. And the truth is, we can't afford to have that tooth taken care of a second time. And so we pull it out because this is our only chance to deal with it. And so that's her story, like just one of many stories in her life of how either she had to shut up or do things differently or work harder in order to be able to move forward and get an education and be able to get a job and move into a middle income place. For my father, it was even more pronounced because his family he had to go to a black college. There was no options on that. There were no black colleges in his hometown, which means he had to leave his hometown. His family, he was one of 8 children. His father was a minister at 4 different churches and also worked on the railway. So he made his money working on the railway, but he preached at 4 different congregations and took care of those congregations. And so when he decided he wanted to go to college, his whole entire life, any dime he had to save up, but he still didn't have enough money to go. And so when he showed up at the college where his friends were at, he crashed on his friend's couch and every day sat on the steps of Fort Valley College and just sat there and waited until someone acknowledged him. And the dean of women acknowledged him and said, what are you doing? It's been 2 weeks, and for 2 weeks, you've been sitting here on the steps. And he says, I want to go to college. I don't have the money. And she says, okay. And so they sat down and she got him 2 jobs and she got him enrolled. And because of that, he was able to get his degree. He was the first person in his family to get a degree. But most of us, I don't think I would have had the fortitude to go and sit on the steps until someone acknowledged my existence. That takes a different level of effort.
Oh yeah.
And that's the piece where I think privilege comes in, is that I didn't have to do that because of what my parents did before me. And I need to acknowledge that I still worked hard. I still had challenges to overcome, but I have been afforded opportunities that are easier to take a hold of or grasp because of what was done before me. And that's the piece I think that's hard for us to accept sometimes, because we want to believe that it was on our own strength. And as Christians, it's the thing that we're told left, right, and center, that it is not because of our own strength. But we still are pretty stubborn, and we still want to believe that it was on our own strength. And so when we talk about privilege, it's an opportunity to acknowledge that there are things given to us because of where we were born, who we were born to it, the time, and all these other things that are going on. And that in no way diminishes the effort we put into life, but it does mean that some people have had to work a lot harder. So.
Well, that's quite interesting about privilege. And I think privilege can span generations as well. I know you were saying how your parents had to overcome some things, but that actually impacted your life and is now impacting your kids' lives. But I think from the privilege of my own experience, I was able to attend a private university that was not cheap because of my generation's past financial privilege that they had. And so privilege, I think it's, as you were saying, I really like that idea. Acknowledging our privilege doesn't somehow belittle our work, doesn't somehow belittle our life experience. It's rather just, in my mind, sort of leveling the playing field. acknowledging who you are, where you've come from, and appreciating what others who are different than you have had given to them, but also have had to work through that would be different than your own experience. I remember I was watching, I can't remember what it was, one talk show where the host was white and the person they were interviewing was black. And the question was asked around privilege. How do we help others, or not even help others, but what do we do when we realize we have more privilege than someone else? And the response by the one being interviewed, he said, you share your platform, or in a sense, you leverage the privilege you have to help others who may not be able to be allowed those opportunities. So they switched roles of who was hosting the show and who was being interviewed, and it was really cool to see how that dynamic works. And so that's something I've been trying to wrestle with, especially as we work in our downtown community, and with the different community members we see down at Hope House and at Lakeside. When I hear the stories of people whose lives they share an experience of their lives, and part of the difficulty they're experiencing now is because of the lack of privilege in a certain area they had growing up. And so I'm beginning to question, how do we leverage our privilege to support others? So thank you for sharing about that, Jaya. And the one thing I thought was interesting, where you talked about that idea of life experience and all that stuff. Do you think that sometimes because of our life experience, we can discount others' experiences? And if so, why do you think we would do that?
I think it's natural for us as humans to read the world through our life experiences. And so how I've seen the world, how I've experienced it, what things were normal for me, what things were not normal for me, I tend to use that as the lens by which I evaluate things that are said to me. And so it's something that I'm working on, and I think it's something that we all have to work on, which is this idea that if I haven't experienced something and someone tells me about it, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist, and even exist in a fair amount of regularity. And it's hard because we think, well, if it hasn't happened to me, if I haven't seen it, then is it really going on? And yet we can only live one life. And so one of the greatest gifts I think we can give to our community and to those who are in our life and those we interact with is to actually believe them when they talk about a life experience, and make space for that life experience and how they've experienced it and how it's felt and what it's meant to them. And allow ourselves to say that just because it wasn't my experience doesn't mean it isn't true, or that it isn't maybe rampant. And I think that's hard because it draws us outside of ourselves and tries to make us look through the world through someone else's eyes. And to be honest, it's really difficult to look through the world through someone else's eyes because you're not that person. You haven't lived through all the things. You don't know all the different pieces that came to this point and why they might read a situation the way they read it. And it's one that I'm really kind of wrestling with, I would say. I've been thinking, when I think about the race issue, I really think about the imagery of Jacob and God wrestling.
Wow.
And this sense that right now we are wrestling over this issue, we're battling, and we're in a sense even like wrestling with God on how do we respond. And I think to address it, we in a sense are going to get wounded the way Jacob was. Jacob's hip gets, depending on how the interpretation dislocated. In some way it's wounded, right? And yet that wound didn't prevent him from continuing to live. It was just a reminder of the significance of this moment. And I think when we really face those dark, ugly parts of our lives and of our society and of the systems we've created, there's no way of coming out of that without being wounded. Because it means we have to admit that we've devalued people, we've devalued experiences, we haven't stood up when we should have. And I don't think that's just on white people. I think that also rests on all of us, because I can say that within my own life, that I can see those moments where I should have stood up and I should have said something and I didn't. Um, and that's, I guess, the real sense that I kind of, when I thought of an image of what it was, that's what the image was. Is like is wrestling with God, and saying, and hopefully saying, we're not going to let go until you help us through this. But knowing there's going to be a cost to that, and there's going to be a wound, and that wounds aren't always bad. They can be reminders that continue to remind us of the change we need to make. Because after Jacob was done wrestling with God, there was quite a few changes that came in his life. Some pretty significant changes in behavior. And not that he was perfect, but he was a different man than he was before. I'd say a lot less selfish, a lot more aware of others' needs and feelings and emotions, a lot more willing to be humble. And it's going to take that same thing in our own life to do it. And I think the other piece about that is we don't know how long that wrestling will take. And we don't even know what form the wound will be. And we don't even know exactly how we're going to come out on the other side.
Yeah.
But we know that if we're willing to stay there with God through it, that there will be a change within us.
I love that. That is so good, Jaya. That is such wisdom. Thank you so much for that. I love that analogy. And I love the phrase you said, the significance of this moment. It does seem like this moment is unlike one we've faced before, experienced before. I just read recently that this is the biggest protest ever in the history of Earth, where all 50 states in the US have had protests, 18 different countries. And that's during a pandemic where we're told we can't go outside. Imagine if it wasn't. There is some sense that this moment is different, which I want to get to in a little bit later, and talk about, that fear of, is this just a moment, or is this going to be a new cycle, a new way of moving forward? But I have one more sort of question to ask you about your experience, or your witness to life. And that's sort of how people can tend to normalize behaviors that they shouldn't. That they just it seems like, oh, that's just the way things are. And then at second glance, it's sort of like, things shouldn't be that way. Do you have any experiences with that in your life?
Yeah, this is something that I've been thinking about. We've had some challenging days in our family, and it's the positive of challenges that often causes self-reflection. And during that self-reflection, I realized things that I've kind of taken as normal that I shouldn't take as normal. So the two things I'm going to talk about are kind of from, more in the past, because they're very concrete. But there's things, even today that exist that I'm still working and struggling through. So my husband's white. We've known each other since grade 5. We started dating when we were 17. So we've been together for 26 years, and 21 of those years we've been married. And what I realized this kind of week that I had really normalized was some of the things that my family did to help us prepare for when our families were going to meet. My husband's extended family lives fairly far away, about 8 hours away. So the first time I was going to go meet them, my parents knew his parents really well and were very comfortable with his parents. But it was kind of time to meet that broader group, and they didn't know that broader group. So they were sending me off with people that they knew and trusted, but they didn't know this other group of people. And we were going into Northern Ontario, which we know is a great, phenomenal, lovely people, but is ethnically is not very diverse. And so they knew that I would be coming in and meeting people who may not have a lot of experience with Black people. And as a result, they may say things and not even mean to be insensitive. It's just a lack of experience. And so my father sat me down. I had this very distinct memory of my father sitting me down and talking me through this. So when you go, you need to be prepared for this. It's probably a good idea that you listen more than talk. Don't want to draw a lot of attention to yourself. You may have some issues. If you do, every night I want you to call and check in with me and make sure, we'll talk it through. Let's see how you're doing. Let's be okay. And at the time, I didn't think anything of it, like nothing. I thought this is just normal. And this weekend, it really struck me that I should never have thought that this is a normal way to prepare to meet your, potentially future in-laws. And similarly, when my husband's family was going to meet my Black family in the US, we were going to be traveling. My husband and I were coming later by bus. And so we were going to be traveling by ourselves together on the bus from Ontario, Toronto, Ontario, all the way to Waycross, Georgia, which is on the border of Jacksonville, Florida. Okay. So we're going a really good distance.
Yeah.
And again, my dad sitting us both down and saying, okay, so when you're traveling, once you cross the Mason-Dixie line, you're not to sit together, you're not to talk to each other, you're not to hold hands, you're not to let anybody know that you are a couple until you get with the family, because the family can keep you safe. And there are going to be people who are not going to be happy about your relationship. And so you do not want to do anything to provoke them or to encourage them. And again, it didn't scare me, but I just thought, okay, this is just what you have to do in order to do what you need to do. And realizing this weekend that I should have been questioning that this was what we had to do in order to stay safe.
Yeah.
And that this shouldn't be what is required of parents to help keep their kids safe. And so there's that real sense there that there's a lot of things, I don't even think I've teased them all out by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of things I've internalized and have come to accept as this is part of what I need to do to exist and operate within Guelph and within the North American context, that really, when I think about it, nobody should have to do. And I know that there's other people who have to do probably even more in order to safely exist within the context. So I don't want to say that by any stretch that my experience is by far the worst. It's had its challenges, but I've had a lot of other things that were stacked in my favor that made it, even if we encountered stuff, we could hire lawyers. We know how to speak in a way that people would respect, at least the levels of power would respect. So that's kind of the piece that I recognize has become really normalized for me, and I'm going to have to work on. If we want things to change, we have to stop accepting that is okay.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy. Like the things that we can just take as that's just how life is. But I think that one of those things that we're doing in this season is asking, is this how things are supposed to be? And there's a lot of things that we're saying no to. And so thank you for sharing those experiences, Jaya. Just with the current climate we find ourselves in with COVID-19, and I've seen different things in the news and read different things about how COVID-19 has impacted people of color as well as those who are less privileged in various ways, more than others. Do you have any insight into that, or have you heard any of that as well, maybe through your experience of people you know, or even with your role at Hope House?
So I have a little bit, so I'm not going to talk too long because then I'd be talking beyond what my knowledge is. So one of the things that we know is that minorities make up a larger proportion of low-income populations. Low-income populations usually have less access to adequate shelter, good quality food, and good working conditions. And that as a result of that, life expectancy is lower because you've got more hypertension, more high blood pressure, more diabetes, more of the things that can come from obesity. And it's a direct result of some of the restrictions or limitations of being able to access resources on their life. So with COVID-19, it's come out even higher, especially in communities that tend to have large industrial complexes, because around the large industrial complexes tends to be your lower income neighborhoods, and those neighborhoods tend to have higher respiratory conditions. So the percentage of Black people with asthma is significantly higher than the percentage of white people with asthma because of where they live.
Yeah.
And with COVID-19 being a respiratory condition, the outcome, if you contract it as a Black person, is lower or worse than if you were to contract it as a white person. If you're just looking at general statistics, not looking at individual people, because there's obviously individual white people who also live in areas where they have higher respiratory issues. And so those things start to play out so that you see groups that have these disadvantages or have these kind of barriers or challenges in their life taking more of the brunt of the pandemic. And so their bodies are not as healthy in general. They have less access to healthcare resources. They have often less flexibility to take time off work. And so all those things compound to essentially higher death rates. So that's kind of the piece on kind of the connection between how being a marginalized population and a pandemic come into play. But there's people out there who can say way more in depth and give very robust statistics and explain it in much more detail. So if that's something that really interests you, I highly recommend you go and look for those resources, because this is the very high level that I provided.
Yeah. Recently, I've been reading a book by Ibram Kendi called How to Be Anti-Racist. And he talks about some of those differences just in general, not related to COVID, in the beginning of his book. And it's quite interesting, things that, I would never have known. I would assume the vast majority of the population wouldn't know the differences in health and those sort of things, just because of the different things that people have experienced, and largely related to race. And speaking of that, we will be sharing some resources in the comments section on our YouTube channel. So wherever you're listening to this, if you head on over to YouTube and type in Lakeside Church, Guelph maybe to help you find it, you'll be able to find some resources listed there as well. But Jaya, before we wrap up, I wanted to just ask if you had any thoughts on where do we go from here? So in a sense of where we're at is we've realized in a greater way for many people for the first time, I've heard that racism still exists, and that it's worse than we thought, and that the Black community is hurting, especially right now. Where in your mind, do you have any thoughts on how do we move forwards? And I'm not asking you to answer a catch-all for everyone, but just some of your thoughts, and then maybe I will share a bit before we wrap up.
I think we're all on a journey here, and it's always that piece about what the next step is. So I think the first thing for me is that we have to be willing to wrestle with God on this, and be honest in that it's a bit of a battle, because we don't quite understand what our role even is. I think all of us have had a role in continuing this type of racism within our culture and community, and we all need to repent of that. But I don't even think I fully understand my role and where I've been complacent and explicit and all those other things. So I think the first part is that we have to be willing to commit to wrestle with God for as long as it takes. And I can't tell you the timeline. That's I think one of those very personal things and such. I think the next thing is to believe when people tell you what their experiences have been. The most painful experience of my life was to have basically people not acknowledge when you told them something that had happened. People that were close to us, and to just discount it as that there isn't an issue at all, and to just believe. And it doesn't mean you have to believe that it's exactly the way it is, because I know that I'm going to read into situations things based on my experience, but at least believe that something happened and that this person experienced it in this way and it meant these things to them. And then the last one is to be willing to change. And all of us have to make changes and have to become uncomfortable. And it's not something that is just one group of people having to do. It's something that all of us are going to have to do. And I know for many of us, I know there are people who this isn't the case. There's some people who thrive off change and it really energizes them. Right. But as someone who loves structure and loves consistency and loves to know what happens, I find change hard and scary. And even if something's bad, sometimes the bad seems safer. And I'd rather stick with the safer than to make the change that could bring us to a new place. Because when we entered into relationship with God and with Christ, we said that we were going to allow that relationship to change us. And we said that we were going to allow that relationship to move us forward into who we were truly created to be. That our identity isn't just rooted in this earthly life, that our identity is rooted within our relationship with Christ and who Christ created us to be, and that who we are today isn't the end of the story. Right. That we're being worked on and developed and grown. And yet, it's very easy to stay stuck at certain points and to stay in certain places because it's become comfortable. And now we're reminded again, it's so in our face what we've become comfortable with. Because it's not like it's new that Black people have been dying at the hands of police. And it's not like it's new that there's been racism going on. They've been putting this stuff out and sharing this for a long time. And even when the story of George Floyd's experience and having died by suffocation at police came out, the first thing that came to my mind was, oh yeah, doesn't that sound very much like that story in New York a few years ago? Like, yeah. It's not like these are new things. Mm-hmm. The difference to me now, and it'll be interesting to see if we can allow it to change us. And that's, I think, the challenge. Will we allow it to change us? The difference is now that the pandemic has afforded more people than ever to be home, yeah. More people to ever be on their social media feeds, and more people than ever to be out of work. And I do believe that for many of us, a barrier to protest, a barrier to marching, a barrier to saying no in a large public way was that we didn't want to lose our jobs because we were comfortable in that. Well, many of those barriers have been taken. So you have millions of people who don't have a place to go to work right now. Millions of people who have time to see what has been going on for large chunks of time. Millions of people questioning, in a sense, the meaning of life because we're having this radical across the world experience that's driving out certainty from our experiences. And because of that, I think we're seeing protests at the level that we're seeing now. And I don't know if we didn't have this pandemic, if people would have been as angry. I think we would have had lots of Black people stand up and march like they have in the past when different individuals have been killed in the US. But we would not have seen the other groups joining them, the amount of white people joining them, the amount of other, colored people joining them. And they're joining them because it doesn't cost them as much right now to join. So.
Yeah, that's one theory that I have that is not, proven, is that COVID has, one of the benefits that has come from this is we have been able to see the value of human life in a greater way, and have a sense of shared experience with the whole globe because of this. Mm-hmm. And while I am challenged by that, it doesn't cost us as much right now. And, my prayer is that that we see this cost as worth it, even as life changes down the road. This isn't just a moment, but this is a trajectory towards change. And I just pray that as a community, as Christians, we become a listening community, that we open our ears to the hurting, to the voices, and like you said, believe what they're saying, believe people's experiences, but also use our own voices to advocate for those who are hurting. Thank you so much, Jaya, for your openness, for your vulnerability, for your admittance that you don't have it all sorted out yourself even, and for your willingness to share. Before we wrap up, would I just be able to pray for you and for our listeners?
Definitely, and I actually have a prayer that I'd like to
Oh yes,
share. So
yes.
I don't know if you want me to do that one first?
Do that first.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we'll do that one first. I'm blessed to have some phenomenal family members, and after a really hard weekend, my one brother-in-law sent me this prayer, and he's my husband's brother, and I kind of feel like it's a prayer that all of us right now could use, and so I'm going to read it for you, and here it is. I pray on you a prayer of hope, not the cheap hope that the world offers, but the hope beyond hope that our faith is rooted in. A hope that takes Paul talks about going hand in hand with endurance. May we together hope for a world where racial discrimination doesn't exist, and may we live into the endurance that will be necessary to get there.
That's beautiful. Let me pray as well. God, we are so grateful that you are a God who gives us hope, gives us faith, gives us love. God, I thank you for the opportunity we have to listen and to speak, God, through the technology we have in this pandemic. And God, we pray that the words of this conversation, God, can help inspire others to gain a sense of hope, but also a desire to experience change in their lives and in this world. God, we pray for your protection over Jaya and over her family in this time. And God, we pray, Lord, that you would shine a light in the life of those in your church, God, that we may be leaders in this cause, and God, that we may have a great desire to see healing and redemption. Lord, we pray this in your awesome name. Amen. Well,
thank you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jaya, for your time again. And for all of those listening, we thank you just for the time you've taken to listen to, as I said, a conversation between two friends. And we hope that you feel blessed by this conversation. Have a good week, everyone.